The year is 1906, and on a September day at the Bronx Zoological Park in New York, hundreds of eager visitors jostle for a view inside the monkey house. Behind the iron bars, amidst chattering chimpanzees and an orangutan swinging on a perch, sits a young African man. He is diminutive in stature, quietly weaving a hammock from twine as a parrot flutters nearby, and a sign on his enclosure reads, "The African Pygmy, Ota Benga, age 23 years, height 4 feet 11 inches, bought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State." The crowd gawks and laughs. Some do so uneasily, others marvel openly. But few seem to be troubled that a fellow human being has been placed on display like an animal. Ota Benga, labeled a missing link, has essentially been caged for public amusement. But this disturbing scene was not an isolated spectacle born of one zookeeper's cruelty. It was part of a widespread practice during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the so-called human zoos. The term human zoo is a modern label for a phenomenon that once went by more genteel names: anthropological displays, ethnological expositions, or living exhibitions. But whatever the name is, the concept was the same. Groups of people, always almost non-European, often indigenous or colonized populations, were exhibited in staged, natural environments for the edification and entertainment of mass audiences. These shows were ostensibly educational, presenting viewers with the chance to observe the world's primitive races up close. In reality, human zoos traded more on sensationalism, racial stereotypes, and a bit of colonial arrogance. They reduced a living human being, whether it be a man, a woman, or even a child, to a curiosity behind a fence or in a cage. Regardless, millions of ordinary people flocked to gape and gawk at the exhibits, as imperial governments, showmen, and scientists touted them off as proof of evolutionary superiority. Yet, even at the time, there were a few critical voices, recognizing the profound exploitation and cruelty at work, but unfortunately drowned out by the clamor of those at the ticket counter. But here we are today to tell the story in hindsight. The human zoos. Not many people know about it, but it's very real. So spend the next hour with me and you'll come out of it with a pretty good understanding. Now, of course, I'm going to begin the video by the customary thank you to the people who are keeping this entire channel ad-free, a veritable oasis away from the slop and the ads and the constant bombardment we're getting these days in 2025. It's going to get worse before it gets better, but you won't have to put up with it on this channel, because we are ad-free, supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, the occasional donation through Super Thanks and PayPal, and those who check out the merch store. But short of that, the best thing you can do for us is spread the word. Tell your friends, share on social media, and do the normal like, comment, subscribe, hit the hype button thing. It really helps us out more than you know. So with all that being said, let's not say anything more about it and just enjoy today's program. Well, we have to begin by saying that human beings in general have always been objects of interest to one another and curiosity. And that especially counts for when you encounter someone who seems exotic or different. If anybody's been traveling around and places, you see kids come up to you that might not have seen a person of your race before, and they ask pretty inquisitive questions. Pretty common for those who've gone to the more far-flung parts of the world. But the idea of exhibiting humans for others to behold is unfortunately not a unique invention of the Victorian age. It has much older precedents. Anthropologists and historians have pointed out that as far back as antiquity and the Renaissance, people have collected and displayed other people who were considered unusual. For example, in the early 16th century, Cardinal Hippolytus Medici in Rome kept a collection of people of diverse races, alongside a little menagerie of rare animals. According to one account from that time, his living collection included individuals from Africa, Asia, and the Americas, described patronizingly as savages who could converse in many languages. The Medici princely curiosity for human diversity was, in its own way, a precursor of the human zoo, though in a more private garden than a public fair. During the Age of Exploration, though, European courts and circuses became increasingly fascinated with exotic peoples brought from overseas. Explorers sometimes abducted or enticed indigenous individuals to return with them as living trophies of discovery. And when the English navigator William Dampier arrived in London in 1691, he brought with him a man from an island in the East Indies, a tattooed native of Miangas, in today's Indonesia, whom Dampier billed as a painted prince. Londoners lined up and paid good money to see this man, exhibited under the stage name Prince Giolo. He was displayed nearly nude to showcase his intricate tattoos, and marketed with sensational stories about his supposed royal status. The public's curiosity was piqued, but at a terrible cost. Within only a few months, the islander fell ill, and then he died of smallpox, never having truly understood what was really going on, this spectacle around him. His brief display in a tavern-turned-museum left behind nothing but a pamphlet and a grim foreshadowing of how often such human exhibitions would end in tragedy. By the 19th century, freak shows and traveling exhibitions of human oddities had become a popular entertainment in Europe and America. Impresarios like the famous P.T. Barnum made fortunes showcasing individuals who they labeled as prodigies or monsters of nature. Barnum's exhibits included the likes of Joyce Heth, an enslaved African-American woman, purported falsely, that is, to be a 161-year-old nurse of George Washington, and the Siamese twins, Chang and Eng Bunker, whose conjoined bodies astonished audiences. In the early 1800s, a Khoisan woman from southern Africa named Saartjie Baartman was displayed in London and Paris under the stage name Hottentot Venus, her body scrutinized and fetishized in a degrading spectacle of racialized voyeurism. And these shows were, in many respects, direct ancestors of the human zoos to come. You see, they treated individual human beings as objects of spectacle, catering to public fascination with the other. But still, classic freak shows typically focused on extraordinary physical traits or disabilities of solo performers. What would emerge in the second half of the 19th century was a shift from single curiosities to whole groups of people exhibited in constructed environments, purportedly as representative samples of races or cultures deemed to be more primitive on the scale of human progress. The 1870s, however, brought an age of empire, and with it a new kind of human exhibition that mirrored the ambitions of colonialism. And no figure was more instrumental in pioneering these ethnological shows than Carl Hagenbeck, a German animal trader and showman who would later found Europe's most famous zoo. Hagenbeck had built his career capturing and selling wild animals to zoos and circuses, But in 1874, he hit upon a new idea. Why not exhibit indigenous people in a setting that recreates their native life alongside the animals of their land? That year, in Hamburg, he staged what is often considered the first modern human zoo exhibit. He brought a group of Sami people, Laplanders from northern Scandinavia, along with their reindeer, sleds, and tents, and he set them up in a faux Lapland encampment for public visitors. Unlike earlier sideshow displays, Hagenbeck's presentation strove for a veneer of authenticity. The Sami were encouraged to wear their traditional clothing, tend to their reindeer, and enact daily routines as if they were at home in the Arctic. By placing people in a simulation of their natural habitat, Hagenbeck made visitors feel as if they were traveling to a distant land, encountering a pristine, primitive culture. And the formula proved to be wildly successful, and it did not go unnoticed by other entrepreneurs and institutions. Hagenbeck's subsequent shows grew even more ambitious. In 1876, he organized a troupe of Nubians from Sudan to tour Europe, followed by an exhibit of Inuits. He referred to them as Eskimos. They were from Labrador in 1880. These early ethnographic shows drew huge crowds. They went to cities like Paris, Berlin, London, and of course the imitators were not far behind. Europe's zoos, exhibition halls, and fairgrounds soon hosted a rotating cast of entire villages imported from around the world. The practice spread to America as well. By the turn of the century, one could find Somali families displayed in native huts at London's Crystal Palace, Plains Indians performing dances in Berlin, or Amazonian tribespeople paddling canoes in a lake on the outskirts of Paris. Promoters often stress the educational and scientific value of these exhibits. The late 19th century was the height of social Darwinist thinking and racial anthropology. Scientists and anthropologists were frequently complicit in these human displays, using them as opportunities to study what they considered as specimens of various races of mankind. In one notorious case from 1880, the great German biologist Rudolf Virchow convened a special meeting at the Berlin Zoo when a group of Inuits were being exhibited. Before an assembled audience of scholars, Virchow examined the Inuit individuals as living examples of a foreign race, measuring their skulls, assessing their physiques, etc., just like as if he was observing captured wildlife. Published reports of the time show an unsettling scientific eagerness to categorize human beings alongside a presumed evolutionary hierarchy. Europeans and white Americans, of course, placed themselves at the pinnacle of the hierarchy, and everybody else was sort of filtered down on the lower rungs. Of course, on those lower rungs were the people who were now on display, whose cultures were dismissed as childlike or unsophisticated. Well, the public presentation of these shows made the message even more explicit. Human zoos became a tool of propaganda of sorts. Each exhibit, implicitly or explicitly, told a story of Western dominance, and here in the flesh were the inhabitants of Africa, Asia, the Americas, the Pacific, living in a state of nature and backwardness, justifying that civilizing mission of colonial powers. When France hosted a grand exposition in Paris in 1878, it featured a display of indigenous people from its new colony of Senegal as part of a grand Negro village. Visitors strolled through a fabricated African village populated by actual Wolof and Serra people, shipped from West Africa, and told to carry on daily tasks under the eyes of French spectators. The exhibit was promoted as showing the fruits of France's colonial enterprise, an imperial trophy case of human beings. It was so popular that a decade later, in 1889, Paris did it again, and this time at an even larger scale. That year's World's Fair, marking the centenary of the French Revolution, famously introduced the Eiffel Tower. But another star attraction was the village Niger. The fair's organizers brought in 400 indigenous people from across the French colonial empire, Africans, Asians, Pacific Islanders, and installed them in an artificial tropical village as living exhibits. Over the 6-month exposition, a staggering 28 million people visited the fair and poured through the native village, making it one of the most successful human zoos ever. But for the majority of those visitors, it was likely the first time they had seen an African or Asian person. The exhibition deliberately framed these families as specimens of a less evolved stage of humanity, conveniently affirming the colonial ideology of the day. But France was not alone in this. By the 1880s and 90s, every major colonial power and many commercial showmen were in the human zoo business. In Germany, Hagenbeck's touring shows were so prominent that the German word Volksschau, folk show, became synonymous with human ethnographic exhibitions. The Berlin Zoological Garden regularly hosted such shows. One of Hagenbeck's Nubian troops drew so many Berliners in 1877 to 78 that the press coined the term Nubiacola, Nubian frenzy, to describe the especially enthusiastic response of certain local women. As one showman later recalled, the tall bronze-skinned Nubian men, often dressed in little more than loincloths, quote, excited the young girls most of all. And more than a few flirtations ensued across the barriers of the exhibit. Whether they were genuine or somewhat in teasing fashion, we don't quite know, but we do know that the entire phenomenon was very different to what people were used to, provoking both titillation and anxiety. German colonial circles were perturbed by tales of women becoming Nubian-crazed. There were even a few that actually ran away with the performers. In fact, when one Nubian troupe prepared to depart Berlin in 1878, police had to be called in after several Nubian men refused to leave their local sweethearts. Armed officers forcibly separated the interracial couples at the train station to ensure Africans would be sent home. Of course, this was before the days of the height of the Weimar Republic. But such incidents, of course, fueled a few racially based fears and even influenced colonial policies. The German Empire would later enforce strict anti-miscegenation rules in its African territories, partly out of concern that the enticements of these shows undermined racial boundaries. Now elsewhere in Europe, the world's fairs and colonial expos became prime venues for human zoos. The Belgian government, for instance, staged a striking human exhibit during the 1897 International Exposition in Brussels. At the behest of King Leopold II, who personally owned the Congo Free State as his colonial fiefdom, the large Congo village was constructed on the grounds of the Tervuren Palace outside the city. And it was there where 267 Congolese men, women, and children were put on display around an artificial lake. They paddled canoes, they cooked food, and performed dances for the visiting public. Belgian citizens came in droves, eager to get a glimpse of their colonized subjects, and it's estimated that 1.3 million Belgians, out of a population of only 4 million at the time, by the way, visited the Tervuren Human Zoo at that summer. Now that's an extraordinary turnout. that testified to the intense popular interest. If only I could have that kind of turnout on my channel. That's okay, we're doing all right though, aren't we? Yet the exhibition, had a deadly side to it too. The problem was that summer was unseasonably cold and damp, and at least 7 of the Congolese performers died of pneumonia, or just cold-related illnesses during the exposition. They had been made to live in drafty imitation huts, wearing light tropical clothing in the chilly Belgian weather. After the fair ended, the bodies of those 7 Congolese were simply dumped in an unmarked mass grave in a local cemetery, their individual names forgotten. The public, however, remembered only the success of the spectacle. So proud were the organizers of their human zoo that they decided to establish a permanent museum of colonial achievements at the site, the institution that is known today as Belgium's Royal Museum for Central Africa, had its direct genesis in that 1897 human exhibit. By the turn of the 20th century, human zoos had become a familiar fixture at major fairs and zoological gardens, not just in Europe, but also in the United States. The 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, or St. Louis, I'm not sure how you guys say it. Some people say Louis, some people say Louis. I don't know. I'll say Louis, maybe. Yeah. Officially, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was a showcase of American progress and imperial pride following the U.S. victory in the Spanish-American War. Fair organizers were keen to display America's new colonial possessions and the diversity of its frontiers, assembled what was possibly the largest human zoo ever on American soil. Get this, over 1,100 indigenous people were brought to St. Louis from overseas, including hundreds of Filipinos from various tribes, that is the Igorot, Negrito, the Moro, etc., recently subdued in the Philippine-American War, as well as Inuit from Alaska, Native American groups, African pygmies from Central Africa, and others. The fair created expansive ethnographic villages, where these people were instructed to live out their days as performers, and for 8 months, fairgoers could wander from a simulated Filipino village to an African pygmy camp, to a Native American teepee settlement, observing what was billed as Stone Age peoples alongside exhibits of the latest electric light technology and agricultural machines, a deliberate contrast between the primitive cultures and the modern civilization. And you might imagine, too, that the conditions for these on display in St. Louis were often harsh. And you would be correct. Many of the Filipinos, for example, were forced to endure Missouri's winter while wearing traditional loincloths and scant clothing intended for tropical heat. A bit of a recipe for disaster. Observers noted that the Igorot villagers brought from the mountainous regions of the Philippines suffered especially when the temperatures dropped. Yet the organizers insisted they continue their daily demonstrations outdoors for the crowds. The Igorots were also coerced into performing a ritual that the Americans found titillating. Kind of, not so much, but they basically made them eat dogs. You see, in their home culture, Igorot communities would occasionally consume dog meat as a part of certain feasts or rituals. And sensing a marketing opportunity, the St. Louis Fair managers had the Igorot group butcher and roast dogs in front of audiences, over and over again. Kind of look at the savages spectacle. Newspapers gleefully reported on the dog-eating Igorot tribe, and this lurid display became one of the fair's most famous attractions. It mattered little that in genuine Igorot culture, such a ritual would be done sparingly, but at the fair it was performed almost daily to satisfy public curiosity. And then there was basic welfare and dignity, both in short supply. A report from the exposition noted that poor sanitation and a lack of potable water in the camps led to outbreaks of dysentery and other illnesses among the performers. Medical care was minimal. That year, at least 2 members of the Filipino exhibit died on the fairgrounds, their names and exact stories barely recorded. It is known that their bodies did not even receive private burials. Instead, in a final insult, the remains were sent to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., to be part of the museum's anatomy collection. In death, these individuals were treated as specimens to be preserved in jars or measured by scientists, emphasizing again how dehumanized they'd become by this entire enterprise. Despite such cruelty behind the scenes, the St. Louis World's Fair was hailed as a great success and drew nearly 20 million visitors. The human exhibits were considered an integral part of the fair's educational mission. Anthropologists involved with the exposition organized special events like Anthropology Days, during which indigenous participants were encouraged to compete in athletic contests. Think about foot races, javelin throwing, archery, stuff like that. This was all to demonstrate their physical prowess, or sometimes lack thereof compared to Europeans. Not surprisingly, the contests were often rigged or laughably mismanaged, and they ended up reinforcing patronizing stereotypes. One American anthropologist bluntly concluded that these savages scored poorly in these pseudo-Olympics, thereby proving the innate superiority of the Anglo-Saxon athlete. Such was the pseudo-scientific smugness that underpinned a lot of these displays. Yet even more disturbing was that case of Ota Benga, the one that we mentioned in the introduction, which we'll talk about in a bit more detail. The young Congolese man who, after appearing at the St. Louis Fair, ended up in a New York zoo. Ota Benga had been bought from the Congo in 1904 by an American specimen hunter named Samuel Phillips Werner, who was tasked with acquiring pygmy people for the St. Louis Anthropology exhibit. After the fair, Werner eventually took Ota Benga to New York, where in 1906 the Bronx Zoo director, William Hornaday, agreed to give Ota Benga temporary housing on the zoo grounds. Now this temporary housing evolved into one of the most infamous human zoo episodes in history. Hornaday, with the encouragement of a prominent racial theorist, Madison Grant, decided to place Ota Benga on exhibit in the zoo's monkey house, effectively labeling him as another specimen in the private collection. So day after day, crowds swarmed the monkey house to see the African pygmy displayed alongside an orangutan. Hornaday posted signs with an overtly racist message, identifying Ota Benga as an evolutionary missing link, a living proof in their eyes that Africans occupied a liminal stage between apes and civilized white men. Many New Yorkers accepted this display at face value. Newspapers ran headlines. One of the headlines was, quote, "Bushman shares a cage with Bronx Park apes," and attendance at the zoo went absolutely bonkers. Tens of thousands came to see Ota Benga. A celebrity for the wrong reasons, I suppose. But here's the thing. This exhibit also sparked one of the earliest organized backlashes against human zoos. Outraged by the sight of a black man in a cage, a group of African-American clergymen in New York protested vehemently. The Reverend James H. Gordon and others demanded Ota Benga's release, denouncing the exhibit as an insult to their race and to human dignity itself. Reverend Gordon pleaded in a meeting with zoo officials, quote, "Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls." Yeah, fair enough. Well, these protests gained some traction in the press. and then a few uncomfortable questions were raised. Even in 1906, there were plenty of people who were asking, how could this be allowed just a few decades after the end of slavery? Bowing to mounting pressure, and probably nervous about a bit of bad publicity, the zoo removed Ota Benga from the cage after a couple of weeks and released him into Reverend Gordon's custody. But Hornaday, the zoo director, felt no remorse. He scoffed at critics, privately writing that when the history of the zoo was written, Ota Benga affair would be the Ota Benga affair, would be its most amusing chapter. So it was easier for him just to dismiss the moral objections as overreactions than to confront the fundamental cruelty of what he had done. But for Ota Benga himself, the aftermath was pretty tragic. Though he was freed from the zoo, he never truly recovered from the trauma and homesickness. Attempts were made to repatriate him to Africa, but they all failed. He ended up in the orphanage in New York and was later sent to a vocational school in Virginia. There, in 1916, a decade after his humiliation in the zoo, Ota Benga took his own life, despairing that he would never find his way home. Now, that story remains one of the most poignant indictments of the human zoo era. The human cost behind the spectacle is laid very bare. So what was it like to be inside a human zoo, looking out at the endless sea of curious faces? We are fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate, to have some testimonies from the very people who were put on exhibit. The voices are rare, as most of the exhibits left no written records, but one pretty good account comes from Abraham Ulrikab, a 35-year-old Inuk man from Labrador, that's northeastern Canada, who along with his family was recruited by a showman to travel to Europe in 1880. Abraham was educated by a Moravian missionary and kept a diary during his months-long ordeal as a living exhibit in Germany, France, and Austria. His diary, later translated, offers a glimpse of daily life in a human zoo from the perspective of the attraction. In September 1880, Abraham, his wife, and their 2 young daughters and 3 other Inuit companions found themselves displayed in the Berlin Zoo, lodged in a makeshift Eskimo hut for visitors to peer at. Abraham writes of the constant intrusion of the crowd, quote, "Going out by daytime is impossible because of all the people. We're totally surrounded by them, by many different faces." He describes how the enclosure would be filled up immediately whenever they attempted to step outside, throngs of Berliners pressing in to get a closer look at the Inuit family with their fur parkas and kayaks. The Inuit tried to maintain their dignity, even attending church services when chaperoned by sympathetic missionaries. But the experience was clearly taxing. In his diary, Abraham notes that one of his fellow Inuit, a man named Tobias, had, quote, stopped being cheerful because he was tired of the people. The novelty of fame, if one could call it that, quickly gave way to exhaustion and melancholy. Just imagine being gawked at, day by day, a specimen behind a railing. Horrible. The Inuit adults keenly felt this humiliation, I'm sure you can imagine. As a German newspaper at the time observed, on the faces of the Inuit women there was a melancholic expression. They knew fair well that they were being exhibited, exposed to the curious, prying glances of old and young. The author of that 1880 article went on to express a pang of conscience that many others apparently did not feel. Quote, "We cannot express a feeling of embarrassment about these human exhibitions, and especially about human exhibitions in zoological gardens." And such sentiment, of course, was far ahead of its time. A rare open criticism of a practice that most people in the era just accepted without question, whether as education or entertainment. Depends on who you ask. Now, for Abraham Ulrikab's group, the journey ended in heartbreak. If you were expecting a happy ending, well, videos are not really one for that. They continued touring through Europe into the winter of 1880, under the management of their handler, who happened to neglect one crucial precaution. He failed to have them vaccinated for smallpox. In Paris, the entire Inuit troop contracted smallpox amid the crowded conditions, and within weeks, all 8 Inuit, Abraham, his entire family and friends, died one by one in a foreign land far, far from home. Abraham's diary entries cease as illness overtakes him, but his earlier words stand as a haunting chronicle of people treated as commodities. He had written wistfully of his hope that they might earn enough money in Europe to improve their lives back home, but also of his longing for Labrador, and the stinging awareness that nothing about their treatment was truly respectful. His diary was later found preserved in a Moravian church archive, one of the first person testimonies of a person who lived and perished as an exhibit. But not all participants in human zoos were strictly coerced. Some saw it as a kind of opportunity, or at least they believed it to be in the first place. Remember that the aim of the game is exploitation. It is not going to be a good deal. A few indigenous performers even managed to subvert the format to an extent. For example, members of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, such as the Lakota Sioux leader Sitting Bull, use their tours in Europe to publicly complain about the U.S. government injustices, rather than just silently play off the role of the savage. But Buffalo Bill's show was somewhat distinct from the ethnological exhibitions. It was more of a scripted performance. In the classical human zoos at fairs and expositions, there was little room for political statements or personal agency. Performers were expected to conform to the stereotype that was assigned to them. Don't go off the script. They were given daily schedules, costumes, and props to perform traditional dances or rituals, whether or not these things were truly traditional or not. If the crowd expected war dances or spear throwing, the organizers made sure that those were on the program. The authenticity of these shows was often quite superficial. In some cases, if real cultural practices seemed too dull or complex for audiences, well, they'd just make up some fake ones. There were instances, too, of African-American performers being hired to pose as African tribespeople, or Filipinos coached to stage mock tribal wars with each other to thrill spectators with a bit of cannibal combat. The priority was entertainment and drama, not accurate anthropology. Daily life in a human zoo was a strange mix, a bit of theatrical routine and a lot of personal discomfort. Many exhibits essentially lived on the fairground or zoo premises for months. They slept in the constructed huts or tents at night, and were on duty whenever the venue was open to visitors. They often had to deal with invasive strangers attempting to touch them, feed them, or talk to them in languages they did not understand. At the 1958 Brussels World Fair, which featured what is often described as the last official human zoo, the Congolese men and women in the exhibit were enclosed behind a bamboo fence. The Belgian visitors would call out to them, trying to elicit a reaction. One contemporary journalist noted that if the Congolese did not respond to the catcalls, that spectators would throw coins or even bananas over the fence, taunting them like animals in a cage. And this was not in 1858, but 1958. And that's well into the era of television, and after the United States had been founded. A pretty sobering reminder that attitudes underlying human zoos did not vanish overnight after the Victorian era. Those being exhibited were typically at the mercy of the organizers for food, shelter, and medical care. Some organizers were more humane than others, sure, but the profit motive often led to cost-cutting and neglect. Remember, it's never cost-cutting, it's profit-raising. Well, the case of the Congolese at the 1897 Brussels Expo and the Filipino and Inuit deaths at the World's Fair show that exhibitors frequently failed to provide adequate protection against climate and disease. Outbreaks of measles, influenza, or smallpox could rip through a native village whose inhabitants lacked immunity to European diseases, tragically echoing the very real depopulation that imperial contact had caused in the colonies themselves. But on top of the physical hardships, the psychological toll was immense. For many, the experience of being gaped at and treated as inferior confirmed their worst suspicions about their masters. It was not uncommon for people to return home with bitterness or a sense of betrayal. Some did not live to return at all. Others were essentially stranded in foreign countries after an exhibition, left to fend for themselves when they were no longer entertaining or useful. In one case, 2 Congolese men who had been part of an American exhibition were abandoned in the U.S. by their agent and had to be taken in by a black colleague in the South until they could eventually go home. The human zoo enterprise was one of mercenary callousness. To the showman, these individuals were just mere exotic commodities to be shuffled around, displayed, and then when the show is over and the ticket sales run dry, to be discarded. But the question remains, why exactly did so many otherwise ordinary people, families, students, businessmen, throng to see these exhibitions and accept them as something that was just completely normal? Well, part of the answer lies in the scientific and social context of that age. You see, human zoos were bolstered by the prevailing racial theories and imperial ideologies of the 19th century. This was the era in which European and American thinkers increasingly spoke of a hierarchy of races, with Caucasians at the top, and Negroids, Mongoloids rather, and other primitive races further down the ladder. Colonialism was rationalized as the white man's burden to uplift or civilize the uncivilized peoples. Now, within that worldview, displaying colonized peoples in a zoo, it kind of made sense. You see, it visualized that hierarchy for everyone to see, and it sort of showed, well, this is what they're like. The exhibits almost always juxtaposed the modern and primitive. Fairgoers could see the newest technological marvels in one pavilion, i.e. all of the fancy European stuff, and then next they would see the loincloth-wearing pygmies in huts, thereby convincing themselves that, well, that technology and empire, well, it was all just proof of inherent superiority. Promoters often described the displays in pretty patronizing and dehumanizing language. They spoke of giving these tribes an opportunity to participate in the world community by traveling abroad, or claimed that the indigenous people were happy and smiling under the appreciative gaze of civilized folk. Colonial officials would say that these exhibits demonstrated the progress being made in educating the natives, or conversely showed how much work remained yet to be done to bring them up to standard. There was also a strong undercurrent of social Darwinism, too, a notion that by observing living fossils of primitive mankind, one could glimpse what the early stages of human evolution looked like. Of course, we were all just trying to figure things out back then. Took a few dark roads. I think that's safe to say. Now, go back to Ota Benga. When he was placed in the Bronx Zoo, It was very explicitly to argue that he represented a lower step on the evolutionary ladder, an idea that prominent scientists of the day, steeped in eugenics, didn't find objectionable. It was just the prevailing theory of that age. Madison Grant, who we've mentioned, the conservationist and racial theorist who was behind the Ota Benga exhibit, would later write a famous eugenic tract called The Passing of the Great Race, warning of a dilution of racial purity. For him and his peers, human zoos were just one more piece of evidence to marshalling their cases, that purity and hierarchy were simply just biological facts. Now, it is important to recognize that none of these attitudes were fringe at the time. World's fairs and zoos were prestigious institutions. When Paris held its vast colonial exhibition in 1931, essentially a final grand showcase of the French Empire, it drew some 34 million visitors in 6 months. Among them were writers, professors, families, and just the general run-of-the-mill tourist from around the world. The expo featured replicas of temples from Indochina, an artificial Madagascan village, and hundreds of colonial subjects performing in each zone. It was advertised as the ultimate educational experience. At the expo's entrance, a grand sculpture depicted France as a maternal figure, leading the grateful Africans and Asians by the hand. Well, inside, human zoos hammered home that message, that the colonized were childlike and static, in need of a hand up to enter that more modernized state of living, while Europe was dynamic and advanced, and so on. And it is pretty chilling to reflect that this occurred in 1931, not even a century ago, and was seen as a pretty family-friendly day out. Get a little bit of ice cream, too, while you're watching all of the loincloth Africans in their cages. Pretty strange by our modern standards. Now, that being said, there were the critics and dissenting voices, even if they were in the minority. We noted that German article from 1880 that decried the embarrassment of human zoos in a zoo. Well, another form of protest came in unexpected areas. In 1903, Japan, which was a colonial power — Europeans do not have the monopoly on colonialism, we have to say that — well, they hosted an industrial exposition in Osaka, which included a human pavilion, essentially Japan's own attempt at a human zoo, featuring indigenous Ainu from Hokkaido, as well as people from Okinawa, Taiwan, and Korea, and they were territories that Japan was integrating into its empire at the time. To the surprise of the organizers, this exhibit triggered anger among some of the very populations depicted. Go figure, right? Well, there were students from Okinawa and Korea who were in Tokyo, and they lodged complaints at seeing their compatriots portrayed as backward and primitive in Osaka. Japanese newspapers published anonymous editorials condemning the Ningen Hakurankai, the human exhibition, as an affront to human dignity. One Japanese writer argued it was, quote, inhumane to exhibit people as if they were objects in a zoo, expressing shame that his country was borrowing a demeaning practice. And this is pretty noteworthy because it shows that not everyone at the time passively accepted things as they were. And even within Europe, as early as the 1880s, and increasingly by the early 20th century, a few voices began to question these shows. Humanitarian activists, especially missionaries or religious figures who had personal relationships with indigenous peoples, sometimes objected on moral grounds. In the Ota Benga case, it was ministers who led the charge. In France and Britain, a handful of journalists visited the exhibitions. Excuse me, I keep saying expeditions instead of exhibitions. I do apologize for that. In any case. well, those who visited the exhibitions in France and Britain wrote articles that hinted at the exploitative nature of it all. But still, the criticisms were often dragged out by those who were, well, overwhelmingly fascinated by it, and of course the official support that such events enjoyed. What ultimately led to the decline of human zoos was a combination of changing public sensibilities. World War II and its aftermath brought a significant change in racial attitudes, at least on the surface. The rise of anti-colonial movements and the beginnings of decolonization after 1945 also made the colonial exhibition seem increasingly anachronistic and, well, frankly, offensive. And is telling that one of the very last instances, the 1958 Brussels Human Zoo, was met with a degree of discomfort, even at the time. Belgium's government tried to present it as a celebration of Belgian-Congolese harmony, which, if you know anything about the Belgian Congo, there's nothing harmonious about that. Well, of course, many observers found it to be quite crass. Good Lord, I need to do a video on the Belgian Congo soon. If you thought my serial killers and insane asylum videos were pretty graphic, well, you just wait until you learn about the Belgian Congo. In any case, by the 1960s, as civil rights movements gained strength and former colonies became independent nations, the entire idea of a human zoo became utterly unacceptable. So looking back, I think it's a bit of a reminder of how easily scientific and cultural institutions can participate in gross dehumanization under the guise of education. The backlash, when it finally came, forced institutions to confront this ugly history. For instance, the very same Bronx Zoo that had caged Ota Benga in 1906, in recent years issued a formal apology, acknowledging that the episode was an unconscionable violation of human rights. I don't know what good that's going to do now, but, I suppose it's the thought that counts. In 2020, the organization that runs the zoo publicly admitted that the zoo's founders and scientists at the time shared in distasteful ideologies that made such an exhibit possible. European museums, too, have had to grapple with the legacy, not least because some still hold remains and artifacts of those once displayed. The remains of 2 Filipino individuals who died in the 1904 St. Louis Fair, for example, were only identified in the Smithsonian collection many decades later, and there are ongoing discussions about repatriating such human remains to their communities. But, I suppose, everyone at their time in history, they just go by their own moral standards. And we've mentioned a few times that this back then was completely normal. I don't want anyone to be so arrogant to think that right now in 2025, or whatever year you're watching it, that we've got it all right. There's going to be things in 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, that the people of those times are going to look back on us and think that we were quite barbaric and quite savage. There's issues in the modern world that need to be contended with. And, well, there are a lot of things that many people think are quite normal. What those things are, well, perhaps you can figure them out yourself. In any case, I think that's enough for today. So, I hope you enjoyed this video on the human zoos. Perhaps you weren't aware of the phenomenon, but hey, it is what it is. Going to thank my top-tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH. Crystal Talvery, Anthony Lucy Brandon Gugububonic, Nicholas Craig Neftis, Alexander Gokhan Dorsey Vanita, Claire Courtesy Carol Robert Mary Bridget Nefertari, Yvette Miss Mochi, 11 Allison Free American, Jennifer Brittany David Cody Brian Are You My Mum Rhonda Carrie KTP Lovely Poma Kevin Marissa Altazakin, Lucy Julianne Rosie Tivolo, Chris Apocalyptic, Brandy Wolfsbane Dude Brinny, Aidan Fabian Michael Ackworm Prince of Persia, River Indian Trail Catherine Alexa Big Gun 101. Sounds like an anime name or something, you know. We also got Brandy, Pesty Hun, Stevie and Jessica. Thank you all so much. Well, we had a good time regardless of the subject matter. Perhaps it's a conversation starter. I don't know. Depends on what kind of conversations you want to have. But as for me, the conversation for today is over. So thank you for listening, thank you for supporting, leaving your comments and thoughts, and a lively discussion. Good night, lots of love to you all, and I shall see you on the other side. Farewell for now.